Howdy folks, Spencer here, and today I'll be showing you how to build out the bridge officer stations on the Garrett Command Alliance Dreadnought cruiser for a variety of different playstyles. As always, chapters to each topic are listed below. Now, before I get too far into things, I want to explain why I'm going with this format, and I have a couple of other notes to go over. When it comes to shipbuilding in STO, you're going to find that the builds for each specific playstyle are fairly static. For instance, the gear that I have on my Garrett right now is almost a one-for-one copy of my latest mirror angle setup. And it's essentially the same plasma CSV setup you guys have seen me use on a variety of different ships on my streams. The only difference here is the Garrett doesn't have an experimental weapon slot, so I just have the kinetic cutting beam on instead. So once you have a build or a specific set of gear that you like to use for a certain playstyle, you basically just move that gear around between the ships you're wanting to use. What changes is your bridge officer setup, and in this video, I'll be going over the bridge officer layouts for the following playstyles: beam fire at will, beam overload, cannon rapid fire, cannon scatter volley, tanking, and torpedoes. And last note here, I'm not opposed to doing a full build video with the gear on it as well, if that's what you guys really want. But given the current environment, I just didn't think it was the right time for that. Tanking wise, my friend Nick NB put out a great tank build video for the Garrett already, and for beams in general, I recently covered some comments from Star Trek Online's lead designer Jeremy Randall regarding some upcoming buffs for beam broadsiding. Beam broadsiding means a buff of some sort for beam arrays. As such, I figured it would be best to wait for whatever those buffs are to be live before doing another beam build video. Now, if you absolutely need some gear recommendations, then check out my Typhoon build guide from last year. The only gear changes since then would be swapping the custom Power Matrix console from the Ilios on, which is the Winter Event ship, and then swapping the Breen shield tunneling trait on, which we just got from the Breen lockbox. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into the builds. First up is for those of you following the unconventional systems meta. This playstyle really likes to have a ton of control abilities on the build so that you can use your universal consoles more often in combat. With that, the builds do end up being quite similar, and I do know that this is a playstyle that some of you are not very fond of, so don't worry, I'll be going over some alternative setups later in the video. Now, up on screen is most of the seating for beam fire at will, beam overload, cannon rapid fire, cannon scatter volley, and tanking under an Uncon setup. The Lieutenant Commander tacticals are going to differ a bit, and I'll be going over those afterwards. And as always, my recommendation for the bridge officers that you should use for space is going to be Watchers or Superior Romulan Operatives for the critical chance and severity buffs they provide. And starting at the top here, for the Ensign Universal, I have this set to a Science. That's going to be beneficial for the Uncon setups. And then I have Tractor Beam 1 there, which is going to work with Uncon. On the Commander Eng with Command, for the Ensign slot, I have Emergency Power to Engines 1. That is going to give you engine power. And if you have the Emergency Con hologram DOF on, which you can get from the Phoenix store, every time you hit Emergency Power to Engines, that's resetting the cooldown on your evasive maneuvers. That's going to help you get around the map quite a bit faster. In the second slot here, the Lieutenant, that is going to be Emergency Power to Weapons 2. And the reason I have rank 2 on and not 3 is because in the Lieutenant Commander slot, I have Eject Warp Plasma 1, and that's an ability that starts at that Lieutenant Commander or third slot on the Bridge Officer. And the reason for the Eject Warp Plasma is because it is also an ability that works with unconventional systems. And then for the last ability here in the Commander slot, this is going to be either Suppression Barrage 3 if you need survivability, or Call Emergency Artillery if you want to get some extra damage. And for the Lieutenant Commander Universal with Temporal Operative, I have that set to Science. I then have Heisenberg Amplifier 1 and Chronometric Inversion Field 1 from Temporal. Those are both Uncons. And then in the third slot, that is going to be a Gravwell 1. There is a temporal ability Timeline Collapse that is similar to Gravwell, but I still prefer to run the OG. I think that one just ends up working out better. And then on the Lieutenant side, I have Jam Targeting Sensors 1 and Scramble Sensors 1, both of which are also Uncons. That brings us up to a total of 7 unconventional systems triggers. And shifting over to the Lieutenant Commander TAC, you're going to see that these are pretty similar. So for the beam fire at will or tanking setups, you're going to do a Torp spread 1, and that's going to be there for your competitive rep engines if you're using those for the speed boost, or for your entwined tactical matrices starship trait to allow you to have better uptime on your fire at will. Then there is attack pattern beta 1, and of course fire at will 3. Now the difference really between the fire at will and tanking setups is with the tank setup, your traits are going to be a bit more configured towards trying to draw a threat, trying to increase your survivability. Whereas if you're doing a fire at will DPS setup, you're just running the generic DPS traits. Now for beam overload, this is going to be either distributed targeting 1 or a torpedo firing mode of your choice for the competitive rep engines in that first slot. Then you have attack pattern beta 1 and of course beam overload 3. For the cannon rapid fire, that's going to be beam overload 1 in the first slot, and that is again for the competitive reputation engines to get the speed boost from it. Then there is attack pattern beta 1 and cannon rapid fire 2. And for the scatter volley setup, this is going to be beam overload 1 again for the first slot for the comp engines, then attack pattern beta 1 and cannon scatter volley 2. So as you see with unconventional systems, these builds do all end up quite similar. Even for tanks with Uncon, they're able to shift a ton of survivability over to their clicky consoles, so they don't really need to change up their bridge officer layouts much. The unconventional route is what I'd recommend if you're looking to get the most performance out of your build, but of course you do need the unconventional system's personal space trait in order to do it, and right now that's running for around 65 million EC on the PC exchange. And again, I know that there are some of you that just absolutely loathe unconventional systems, and after I go over an Uncon setup for a Torp build next, we'll be going over some non-Uncon setups for some of the playstyles. Okay, so for the rest of the bridge officer layouts in this video, I'm just going to be showing them to you here in game. And right now we've got the kinetics or Torp setup with Uncon. So still quite a few things that are very similar. The Lieutenant Commander Universal with Temporal is the exact same as the other builds so far. The Ensign Universal, I swapped that out to Attack, so you can do Chemosight 1, which is a pretty big deal for these Torp setups. The Lieutenant Commander Attack is Fire at Will 1, Cannon Scatter Volley 1. Those are both for Entwined Tactical Matrices, because when you hit those, you're going to get a Torp spread, and then a Torpedo High Yield 3. On the Commander Eng with Command, this is Emergency Powered Engines 1, Emit Unstable Warp Bubble 1. That is an Uncon, it's just not as good as Eject Warp Plasma, but we can't run Eject Warp Plasma because on a Torp setup you really want to have Concentrate Firepower 3 on, and that would go in the same spot the Eject Warp Plasma goes. And you also want to have Call Emergency Artillery on, so again, you just don't have anywhere to go with an Eject Warp Plasma. And then for the Lieutenant Psi, I moved the Tractor Beam 1 down to this, and I dropped Jam Targeting, and then I have Scramble Sensors 1 on. With this, you do still have 6 Uncons, Heisenberg, Chronometric, Gravwell 1, Emit Unstable Warp Bubble, and then Tractor Beam and Scramble, so you're still able to get quite a bit from Uncon on this setup. So here is the Torp setup without Uncon. So you don't need to focus on having a bunch of control abilities on your build. You can put a bunch of other stuff on. So what I've done here is for the Lieutenant Commander Universal with Temporal Operative, you don't really need any of the temporal stuff right now. I mean, recursive shearing would be nice, but you just don't have room to run that alongside Mine's Dispersal Pattern Beta 2, an Attack Pattern Beta 1, a Cannon Scatter Volley 1, a High Yield 3. You would have to give up your High Yield 3 or your Mine Dispersal Pattern in order to easily fit recursive shearing onto the build, and that's just really difficult here. So I foresee that most of you that would be doing this without Uncon on a Torp setup would probably go with something like this, where it's Chemosight 1, Attack Pattern Beta 1, and then Mine Dispersal Pattern Beta 2. On the other Lieutenant Commander Attack, that would pretty much be the same, so Fire at Will 1, Cannon Scatter Volley 1, and then a High Yield 3. On the Ensign Universal, I have that back to a Psi, and that's got Tractor Beam 1 on it. And for the other Psi seat here, I just went with 2 abilities that deal damage, so Very Cold in Space and Delayed Overload Cascade. You could also do Structural Analysis for the debuff there, and if you need some cooldown reduction, Photonic Officer would also be perfectly fine. And then for the Commander Eng with Command, just one difference here. The Emit Unstable Warp Bubble got dropped out for Structural Integrity Collapse, so Emergency Powered Engines 1, Structural Integrity Collapse 2, Concentrate Firepower 3, and Call Emergency Artillery 3. This setup would work fine in really short duration content, but in longer duration stuff, you're going to feel the loss of Uncon. And for a tank that doesn't have Uncon, I'm assuming you're going to need a bit more survivability, given you're not going to have your Universal consoles up as much. So what I've done here is for the Lieutenant Commander Universal, I've got Structural Analysis 1 that's going to be a debuff. Photonic Officer 1, that's for some cooldown reduction for your bridge officer abilities, and I did keep the Gravwell 1 on. On the Ensign Universal, Chemosite 1. On the Lieutenant Commander TAC, that's the exact same as before, so Torps Spread 1, Beta 1, and then a FAW 3. And for the Commander Eng, that's Emergency Powered Engines, Emergency Powered Weapons, then Reverse Shield Polarity 2. So Eject Warp Plasma was dropped for Reverse Shield Polarity here. And the Suppression Barrage 3 remains on. And then for the Lieutenant Science, that's got Science Team 1 on it if you're going into content where you've got enemies that are going to be subnuking you. And then I have a Hazard Emitters 2 on for the heal and the debuff cleanse. So there's probably some other ways you could go about this. This is more of just a classical tank setup. It's not ideal in the current meta, but if you're in a budget situation where you can't afford Uncon, or if Uncon just is something you just absolutely cannot stand, then this would be sufficient for tanking. And for the remaining directed energy weapon playstyles without Uncon, I'd probably go something like this. So Structural Analysis 1, Delayed Overload Cascade 2, and then the Gravwell 1 on the Lieutenant Commander uni with Temporal. On the Ensign Universal, do a Chemosite 1. Then on the Commander Eng with Command, that would be Emergency Powered Engines 1, Directed Energy Modulation 1, Emergency Powered Weapons 3, and then Call Emergency Artillery 3. And again, if you need more survivability, you can just drop the artillery for Suppression Barrage. On the Lieutenant Science, I didn't have one on this bridge officer, but a Very Cold in Space, which is from the Winter Event Store, would be fine there in the first slot where I have Tractor Beam. And then Photonic Officer 1 again for some cooldown reduction. And then for the Lieutenant Commander TAC, this would probably be a little bit different from what I had before with the Uncon setups. I'm guessing if you're doing this at more of a budget level, you probably have a torpedo on the build still. On the high Uncon setups, we drop a torpedo because with how much you're able to get from the Awani console, especially with it cooled down all the time, you just don't really want to slot a torpedo most of the time. So you'd probably do the Torp Spread 1 and then Beta 1 for most of the do setups, and then swap the third slot out on the Lieutenant Commander TAC for whatever your firing mode is. So Fire at Will, Beam Overload, Cannon Rapid Fire, Cannon Scatter Volley, they'd all be very, very similar. It's just you'd be swapping the firing mode around to whatever you're doing. So hopefully this helps you guys. Again, I know this isn't a full build video like some of you were hoping for, but like I said in the intro, when it comes to building ships out in STO, the gear is pretty much going to remain the same for the playstyle you're doing. It's just, again, the bridge officer setup that is going to change and be ship dependent. So hopefully this helps you guys out. If you have any questions, feel free to join either the CasualSAB or STO Builds Discords, both of which are linked down below. And if you're not familiar with that entire concept of shipbuilding where you just move the gear around essentially, check out Mara's How to Build an Effin' Ship video for Do. It's a bit abrasive, it's got a bit of language, some people aren't a fan of that, but it is a really, really great guide that's going to help you better understand how to build ships in this game. But that's going to be it for today. Thank you all for tuning in. See you guys around.